today. It's the story of guitars and the hidden story of where they come from and how they're made. The guitar is a magical thing to some people. Bruce Springsteen described it as the master key, the sword in stone, the sacred talisman, the staff of righteousness, the greatest instrument of seduction the world has ever known. Chris Gibson's my guest today. Chris is an academic at the University of Wollongong. He's been playing guitars since he was a teenager. And for the past few years, Chris and his friend Andrew Warren have been travelling all over the world, from Brazil to Spain to Hawaii to the forests of Canada, to trace the origins of the guitar and the places that have given up their timber to make its respective parts. Chris and Andrew Warren have written a book of their global investigation, and it's called The Guitar, Tracing the Grain Back to the Tree. Chris is with me now. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Richard.
You brought a bunch of guitars in. What's the one on your lap?
I did. This here is a 1973 Guild acoustic guitar, what's called a dreadnought shape, so it's a big, boomy thing, made in the year I was born. It's a kind of classic acoustic guitar. I, like many other guitarists, suffer from the disease of permanently wanting more guitars, so I brought a sample in.
What guitar have you got there?
So this here is a Martin 000, and it's a Depression era, well, it's a reproduction of a Depression era guitar. And it's just about entirely made of mahogany, so it's got this, it almost looks like a giant chocolate bar.
Take me through the parts of the guitar, using the guitar that's on your lap right now, the Guild guitar.
Yeah, sure. So if people imagine in their minds a guitar, you'll know that it has a neck with a fretboard on it, metal frets, which you push your fingers down to play the notes, and then it has a big fat body on it. And on the front of that, what we call is on an acoustic guitar, what we call the soundboard, which has the hole in the middle. And if you tap it, you'll hear it reverberating around. And what that is the sound waves inside the guitar bouncing around inside. That's crucial to the story because the soundboard becomes a really important piece on the guitar. Then we have obviously a back on the guitar and curved sides on the guitar too. They have to do some very clever things to get the wood to curve like that in a very precise way to match the front and the back. You've got a neck, which, as we'll discover, has to be made from particularly strong woods. And we have a headstock at the end with tuning pegs where you join up your strings and tighten them. You know, it's a stringed instrument. It actually belongs to a family, actually a really large family tree of stringed instruments that include obviously violins and cellos and mandolins, but also a whole range of other instruments that go back into the medieval period as well.
Now, what are the different timbers that have been used to make that guitar on your lap, as far as you know, Chris?
So, yeah, this guitar is your sort of stock standard acoustic guitar. It has spruce on the soundboard. In fact, it's a type of spruce called Sitka spruce from the Pacific Northwest, and it has rosewood on the back and the sides. 1973, by then, the world was changing. The guitar industry was changing from using Brazilian rosewood, which historically had been the main source of timber for use in guitar making, over to Indian rosewood. So it could be one or the other. It could be Brazilian or it could be Indian rosewood. It has a mahogany neck and it has a rosewood fingerboard on it as well.
Right. And why is the front of the guitar, the soundboard, made from a different timber from the one on the sides and the back of it?
Yeah, it's a combination of acoustic qualities and structural qualities and a little bit of aesthetic appeal as well. A whole set of things go into deciding what timbers to use on the front there. I mean, the whole production technique and the wood choices really come down through those hundreds of years of the generations and generations of craftspeople known as luthiers who developed the art of stringed instrument making, really kind of perfected actually in the Baroque period. And they discovered that the spruces of Central Europe had the right kind of combination of strength and beautiful look to them, but also an ability to reverberate efficiently and pleasingly. So with any stringed instrument, what you do is you basically take a box. I mean, you could take a cigar box or a tissue box or any other box, and you could put strings on it. And if you tighten those strings enough and pluck them or strum them, you'll get a sound out of that. But depending on what materials you use, it might sound dull, it might sound weird, or you might not get much sound out of it at all, or you might find that box pulls itself apart. So one of the things about guitars, particularly given their size compared to something like, say, a violin, is that the strings are pulled really tightly, and that puts a huge amount of pressure on the timbers that you've got on the front there. So it's kind of only joined on here down where the strings end and meet what we call the belly of the guitar, the sort of fat bit down underneath the sound hole. It's really only joined on there by a kind of slither of wood. So it's only the strength of the soundboard that's physically holding this thing together. Were it not for that, the actual timber's ability to withstand that pressure, the whole thing would actually be dangerous. It would explode on you.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I used to play a 12-string, and I used to have these awful fantasies sometimes that one day the neck would snap and take my hand off with under the stress of 12 strings, that some of them are quite razor sharp. It would just go bang like that. So it needs to be particularly strong, as does the neck. But there's also the fretboard. Now, that's a different timber for the neck, isn't it? The fretboard that carries the frets where the fingers press down onto the strings to create chords or pick out notes.
Yeah, that's right. So on this, it's rosewood, but on a lot of guitars, you'll also find ebony on there. So the fretboard is a thin slither of wood that's glued onto the neck. So it doesn't need to have the strength so much, but you really need to be able to feel it in your fingers. Any stringed instrument, obviously, you're holding notes down with your fingers. So what you're physically feeling there is really important, and the ability to be able to slide your fingers up and down the neck, up and down the fretboard, and yeah, it's like a feel thing, I guess. And so rosewood and ebony have got that kind of quality to them. They tend not to be varnished, actually. They tend to be raw pieces of wood. So they've got to be able to withstand the elements. They can't, degrade in the same way, but they've also got to feel really nice under your fingers to play.
Right, so ebony is particularly oily. Is that one of the reasons why it's suitable for a fretboard?
Yeah, exactly. If anyone's ever played an instrument that's got an ebony fretboard to it, it's got this slinky feel to it. It really is. You almost think it's like an artificial material, actually. Yeah, slinkiness is the best thing.
Slinkiness, it is indeed a slinky wood. Indeed, it
slinky wood.
When it comes to electric guitars, now they're solid-bodied. Is the timber as important for an electric guitar as it is for an acoustic guitar, which has to carry all that resonance from inside its body?
Purists would say that it's probably not as important. Yeah, look, it's true on an acoustic guitar. It's like a sommelier kind of matching a fine wine with a beautiful meal that you might be having. An electric guitar is maybe the equivalent of going down to your local kebab shop or something by comparison, but you're still going to eat it, right? It's still got to be enjoyable. It's still got to sound good. And the wood does actually influence even an electric guitar too.
But it's mostly the pickups, isn't it? The electric pickups that pick up the sound from that's much more important than the timber, surely, on an electric guitar?
Yeah, look, if you go onto guitar forums or meet guitar players anywhere, it becomes this permanent source of debate. What's the most important thing about the sound? I do subscribe to that theory. For me, it's about the pickups and the amp you're using, and the wood for me on an electric guitar is a little bit subsidiary. But, there are purists and aficionados. So if you play a Gibson Les Paul, for example, which is a really heavy guitar made out of mahogany with a big fat maple top on the top, it has really distinctive pickups, but people who are into Gibson Les Pauls love that sound, and you really can't get it many other ways except using those combination timbers.
In the life of a guitar player, there's that moment. For me, this is when I was 16. When you pick up a guitar, you've looked at a chord chart and you figure out for the first time how to strum out a beautiful, clean and clear guitar chord. And it just makes this lovely sound, and it's so beguiling. And I couldn't put down the guitar for a month after that, I think, until I could play it properly. When did you start with guitars? What's your story with the guitar, Chris?
Yeah, it's a little bit similar to that, to be honest. So I grew up in Western Sydney. I'm a son of migrant parents. We moved out from England when I was a kid and didn't have much money, so I didn't really have access to musical instruments, to be honest. And I borrowed a neighbour's sort of beaten up Japanese guitar. It was a cheap and nasty guitar, so they were thought at the time. And like you, it was a challenge to get it tuned. But once I could actually get that chord ringing out of that guitar as an 11-year-old, it was just magic. And I quit Boy Scouts and I quit the soccer team, and I just spent every afternoon after school just trying to imitate Jimi Hendrix or whoever it was.
Well, I think when you're a teenager, you're a pretty graceless, awkward creature. You keep bumping into furniture, you're too tall, you get spots. But having a guitar can make you suddenly graceful for that moment.
Yeah, and for me it was a bit of a coping mechanism, to be honest. Like I credit my parents, but also my dog and my guitar for kind of getting me through teenagehood. It was like something to pour your attention and obsessions and...
all your heart and feeling into it, those things. Yeah. Are you now in a position where you can explain how the guitar works, how it makes sound?
Yeah, look, it isn't that complicated, actually. Like if you pluck a string under extreme tension, the string itself is wobbling backwards and forwards, so it's producing sound waves. Now, if you had a solid block of wood and you didn't have an empty box with a hole in it, you'd actually be able to hear it, but you wouldn't hear much. It'd
like an electric guitar when it's not plugged in. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the sound waves are caught inside the guitar, inside that box. I mean, it's a weirdly shaped box, but it's a box nonetheless. And they bounce around inside of there and come out through the sound hole. But here's the twist. The whole box also reverberates. So this bit on the top, what we call the soundboard, the bit of the guitar that has the hole in it, is itself a projecting piece of material.
So sound waves are coming out of the box,
the whole thing is actually reverberating and projecting out
of the timber itself, not just the sound hole. It's coming out of the timber itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you play a guitar, so I mean, I can obviously hear the strings, but what I can feel in my body, up against my chest and through my arm, is I can feel the whole instrument shaking, literally.
That's the pleasure of it too.
Yeah, that's kind of part of the feel of it. So it's that combination, really, the way the acoustics bounce around in there. It amplifies and then projects out through the sound hole, but the whole instrument itself is actually projecting that sound as well. So the sort of real art, the dark art, if you like, of instrument making is to try and combine design features like the shape of the pieces of wood, the thickness, the way they combine together, even the glue you use. All of those sorts of bits of craft knowledge combined with the actual woods themselves, knowing that this particular piece of spruce or that piece of cedar, if you combine it with a piece of mahogany or rosewood, you're going to... Someone described it like it's like having faders on an equalizer and you're pushing them up or down. You can create a bassier sound, you can a deep booming sound, you can create a trebly, punchy sound. You can vary all of those things by varying the woods and the combination of them that you put together into a guitar.
So you and your friend Andrew have been travelling all over the world, from the Pacific Northwest of Canada to Brazil, to Spain, to Portugal, to Hawaii, to the Bunya Mountains in Queensland. Where does this start for you, this journey of finding out about the guitar? What sparked the idea in the first place?
Sometimes ideas find you don't find them, and this was certainly a case of that. So, I grew up playing music and I ended up writing my PhD on music, but in a geography department. And at the time, I'd loved geography as a kid too. That's the other thing. Like I sort of sat at night looking at atlases and I was just a real geography nerd. And I was good enough at it that I could get a scholarship to go on and do honours in a PhD. And working in remote Aboriginal communities actually, and I was looking at issues of land rights and environmental management and economic development, and just noticed that there were lots of kids playing reggae and old fellas playing country music, and so these places were just full of music. And I went back to my supervisor who said, actually, maybe you should write about that. Maybe you should write about music and its connection to place, to geography. 20 years went by and I did a whole lot of research projects, and I had a PhD student, Andrew, who wrote his thesis, and then we wrote a book together about surfboard making, of all things.
And does that begin in Hawaii?
Yeah, so that's right. It's a Polynesian leisure form, and board making has happened across the Pacific and particularly in Hawaii. So we went to Hawaii to interview Hawaiian board makers who are reviving the craft of wooden surfboard making. So felling trees in the traditional manner, blessing them before they're converted into surfboards and canoes and outriggers and other things as well. It was a lovely thing to be able to do. But when we were there and towards the end of our experience there, a Hawaiian elder who'd been really helpful to us suggested that perhaps we'd like to go and see the trees. Perhaps we'd like to go and see these trees that they're increasingly scarce but are used in surfboard making.
And what tree is that?
A tree called koa was one that we were really keen to find. And in Hawaiian language, it's a word for warrior. It's quite a noble tree that has a lot of mythology and a lot of practical uses associated with it. Anyway, the koa tree grows in only very particular bands of elevation on the Hawaiian volcanoes in an area of territory known as Waulipo, which is like where the cloud hangs around the volcanoes. And so a very particular kind of forest grew there, and inside that forest grew these koa trees. And we were chaperoned by Hawaiian elders to see those trees. And we had a conversation with them about the fact that they become scarce. A lot of that land has been, well, it was colonised by the Americans, of course, so it was converted to pasture land and cattle ranches and those sorts of things. And that in combination with climate change and a bunch of other threats has meant that those forests are really degraded and it's hard to find those old trees. So anyway, we were talking about the sadness of that, really, and we just struck up a conversation saying, well, actually, it's also a guitar timber. The acacia koa, this tree, has also been used in making guitars and ukuleles, since the early 20th century. And we just sort of realised that it was just like a moment. We're on the side of a volcano in the middle of nowhere thinking, okay. And I'd never really joined the dots before, but it dawned on me that there was another story there that needed to be researched. And for me, I guess it was about trying to connect up the gawky teenager in the, western suburbs playing a cheap guitar and looking at atlases, and then my professional identity as an academic geography researcher.
So you're connecting the guitar, the thing itself, to the places it comes from, its component timbers come from. I don't know if I ever gave that any thought at all when I was playing guitar. Had you given that much thought?
No, not at all. And, well, I mean, as a teenager and young adult, I was one of, I think, many people who had cheap guitars. So it was, I was almost ashamed of the cheap guitars I had.
I can remember in guitar shops, at the higher end, they'd say, this is a rosewood, something or other. And maple, I think, might have been advertised as a specialist timber in the guitar shop on the guitar. But other than that, I didn't really have any idea of the timbers that went into it. Yeah,
look, and I think that there's sort of two things there. One is that, it's an interesting instrument. It's got one foot in a kind of connoisseur camp, right? So you can spend $10,000 on a beautifully handmade guitar and it'll be an amazing instrument, and you can have the kind of fine timbers involved in it. And, there's quite a high level of knowledge about those timbers among people who are really into guitars and like their guitars to sound a particular way. Guitars also have like a foot in the punk camp, right? Like it's a folk instrument. It's something that gets passed around the campfire. Same as ukuleles, similar kind of thing. So it's a folk instrument at the same time. So for a lot of guitar players, it's something that you love, and that is, for me, it's something that helps you through teenagehood, but you don't really think twice about what's actually in it.
So let's go back then to the origins of the guitar as a musical instrument in Europe. You went over to Spain, where the guitar finds its origins. Now, we've had lutes and ouds and sitars and mandolins for donkey's years, for millennia. At what point does the guitar start to appear in the world, and where does it do that?
Guitars or guitar-like instruments emerged almost simultaneously, actually, across different parts of Europe, just slightly different shapes and different combinations of strings. Some had 4 sets of doubled up strings, so they had 8 strings altogether, in pairs, and they might have been tuned more like a mandolin would be tuned. So it all starts to come together in Andalusia, in the south of Spain. So in the second half of the 1700s, so 1750 through to kind of 1830, we start to see several design features all come together in what we now know as the guitar. 6 strings, the shape, the bracing patterns on the inside of the guitar. So the origins of the guitar really are in Andalusia, and one city in particular, Cádiz, which is right on the southern sort of tip of Spain, is a place that had a whole community of guitar makers in the late 1700s there, and really perfected the design of the guitar.
So tell me about this guitar maker you met in Spain.
Yeah, his name is Tito Diaz, and a tiny, diminutive Spanish guitar maker who is really steadfast about holding true to the guitar-making tradition of Andalusia, which is where the the Spanish guitar, the design as we now know it, really comes together.
And what's his workshop like?
Yeah, it's this tiny little space, really. And remarkably, it's the same layout as luthiers in the late 1700s had. It's got a small workbench in the sort of central area of the space, and it's the kind of bench. It's almost like an operating table, if you like, that is where all the carving and the putting together of the guitar takes place, and then just simple shelves around with the materials, and the woods are up in the corner, up near the roof, where they season and dry.
And how much love does he put into each guitar?
He's so passionate about it, and it's amazing listening to him. Yeah, describe his love for the guitar. He described his guitars as his children. So he named every instrument. Every instrument that leaves the workshop is named.
Does he find it hard to surrender them to his clients?
Yeah, he did say that. Some of them he doesn't want to let go. But it's as a consequence of that, he can only produce a certain amount per year. So he's not living a lavish lifestyle by any means. So it takes a lot to kind of, uphold that tradition.
What was it that made the guitar popular?
In the Victorian era, for example, it was considered quite a proper instrument to learn.
It was a refined thing, was it?
It was like a respectable instrument. And it was at the time that you had the emergence of the middle class, of course. And so having your children learn musical instruments was one of those things that you could demonstrate that you're a good parent and that your children are doing the right thing in inculcating themselves into the ways of society.
Was it like the piano? Was it first suitable for educated ladies?
It was, and in fact, it was an instrument more associated with women than men in that period.
Really?
Yeah.
Boy, how things have changed.
That's right. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that the growing market for guitars now is among women. And it's a bit of a challenge, I think, to the sort of male orthodoxy of the industry. You know, when I was a kid, going into a guitar store was and I was a young man, I wasn't a young woman, but it was this intimidating thing. You're going into a guitar store where, unless you had long hair and could play 1,000 notes a minute, you sort of weren't welcome. But it's come full circle now. So the industry's having to actually realise, there's a long history of this instrument being played by both men and women, and actually in a neat kind of way, it's come full circle.
So this is where it finds its origins, in Spain. What kind of timbers were they using at the outset?
They were using some of the classic timbers, so European spruce, for example. They were also using Spanish cedar and cypress. Cypress was this cheap timber that was available and used it was actually what they made casket boxes out of for funerals. But then, around 1750, 1760, we start to see instruments being made using rosewood and exotic timbers that have come from South America, from Africa potentially, from other parts of the world. One of the things that we wanted to really get to the bottom of was how did they get there, and why was it that it was in the sort of second half of the 1700s? It was like a switch had been flicked, and all of a sudden guitars go from being very European in their woods and design to being much more cosmopolitan, having these Brazilian timbers on them. So we couldn't for the life of us figure out how that was so, and nothing had ever really been written about it. So we had to kind of go on a sort of a detective journey, if you like, to try and figure out what was the sort of historical story of rosewood.
I'm guessing the origins of this lay in the Spanish and Portuguese empires, overseas empires. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is, but of course Spain and Portugal had its interests in South America from the early 1500s. So you'd think that those woods would have been coming back into Europe and would have made their way into instrument making through the 1500s and 1600s. One of the things that we did is we found every old musical instrument we could find in museums across Europe, and that showed that rosewood wasn't turning up at all in the 1500s and 1600s. Only after 1750, 1755, 1760, in and around there, suddenly rosewood starts to appear. So it was really strange. It was when we were in Lisbon and trying to sort of get to the bottom of it, and landed in Lisbon, and the first thing that the taxi driver said to us as we left the airport, so welcome to Lisbon. The first thing that the taxi driver says is, Lisbon, there was a huge earthquake here in 1755. It's like people still remember it, talk about this giant earthquake that happened in 1755. That's an unusual thing for a taxi driver to say about their city as the first thing that, as you get out of the airport. But then walking around the city centre of Lisbon and coming across an old basilica, an old church, which dates from 1786. And in the shop fronts of shops in and around that city area, we see this dark wood everywhere, like it's on shop fronts, it's the window frames, and it's the front door of the church, and all of the pews and the altar. There's just massive solid blocks of this incredibly beautiful dark wood. And we're looking at it thinking, it's rosewood. It's physically in the fabric of that city, is this wood that in the guitar making world is really rare, and it's, you only ever see it in tiny bits on musical instruments. But to see a whole city, the actual fabric of the city has got such a prominent amount of this timber in there. So we started to go, okay, there must be a story here. So how rosewood ends up in guitars and how it ends up in instrument making, really nothing much to do with instrument making. It wasn't arriving in Europe to be destined to be made into instruments. It was arriving in Europe for the first time, really, in any quantity after that 1755 earthquake.
So Lisbon was rebuilt with these masses of Brazilian rosewood.
Exactly. And once that had happened, of course, it's flowing through the port. It's becoming available for cabinet makers, furniture makers, and then instrument makers to be able to use. But in so doing, it utterly transforms the history of Brazil. Brazil goes from being a kind of colonial outpost, which had been part of the kind of plantation slavery trade, really. Like that, Portugal's interest in Brazil had been around sugar. So it changes the nature of the relationship between Brazil and Europe, and Brazil starts to become much more important in the Portuguese mentality, and investment starts to flow. Brazil starts to become a much more prominent place. It industrializes, agriculture spreads, the export trade connects up Brazil with Portugal and Spain increasingly. So we see a kind of really dramatic change in Brazil as a consequence.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app, or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
Now, a key figure in the popularisation of the guitar is a man called C.F. Martin. Tell me his story, please, Chris.
So C.F. Martin came from a little town called, and I'm going to get the German pronunciation of this incorrect, but it came from a little German town right near the Czech border called Markneukirchen. And it was a centre for instrument making. So it was a real hotbed, I suppose, of violin making in particular. But at around that time, it was when the guitar became this increasingly popular instrument, and the Spanish had perfected it, and their influence was spreading across Europe.
This is like the mid-19th century, thereabouts?
1830s, beginning of the 1830s. And so he went off to Vienna to learn how to make guitars in a kind of craft tradition. And at the time, the guilds were really strong. So if you wanted to make instruments, you had to be a member of the guild, and you had to kind of prove your worth by being a master. And being able to do that required a whole set of tests that you had to go through, and it was really quite difficult. But the guitar was becoming hugely popular. Like, the demand was overwhelming. So he basically downed tools and had enough and emigrated to the United States, where the guilds didn't control the trade, as it were. So he went to a little town called Nazareth in Pennsylvania and set up shop there. He made beautiful instruments, and he was really part of a wave of population growth and an emerging middle class and a demand for guitars. And so he, among many other guitar makers at the time, really tapped into that and developed what we now know as the modern guitar industry.
So as they started being mass-produced after the Civil War in America, was there a tension there between cheap mass-produced guitars and these finely made artisanal objects?
It is, and it's a tension that you see running through to the present day, really. So you started to see other companies emerge. James Ashbourne is one who wasn't a luthier by background. He was a tool maker, and he figured out how to design different machinery to automate some of the processes. He suddenly mass produces guitars, and then Chicago emerges as this real centre for the industrial production of musical instruments. And so you've got companies like Washburn and Harmony Guitars, huge factories that are churning out hundreds of thousands of instruments per year. And, they're cutting corners and they're automating bits of the process, and they're using different kinds of woods that maybe aren't as good as the ones that are used in a beautiful Martin guitar, attempting to try and satisfy that demand.
But the manufacture of cheap guitars that aren't particularly good, it seems to me that's where we get the whole of 20th century music from, or pop music and rock music nonetheless.
That's the irony. So those beautiful Martin guitars were certainly around in the hands of players across the United States through the late 1800s into the early 20th century, but it's actually it's the cheaper guitars in the hands of bluegrass players, hillbilly musicians, blues players in the Deep South. They couldn't afford beautiful instruments, so they were buying cheap guitars out of mail-order catalogues. In fact, they were probably buying those guitars second-hand from someone else who ordered them through a mail-order catalogue from one of the big mass producers in Chicago, for example. And it's in the hands of those players that we start to see the whole history of popular music really being rewritten.
So you get these cheap guitars going down into the Mississippi Delta, and plantation workers use them to create blues music. And then in the Appalachians, that's where hillbilly and bluegrass comes from these cheap guitars.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. It's one of the things about popular music and folk music, isn't it? It comes from the streets, or it comes from the fields, it comes from the front porch or from the bar. It doesn't come from the concert hall. There is something about the guitar that's somehow more democratic, it's more accessible. You know, for me, I think it's about that mass production. I mean, it's a tension. I would love to think that every guitar in the world could be handmade and be a beautiful instrument that's been customised for you as a player. I mean, that's an amazing thing to think that can even be the case these days. But it's just not realistic for the average Joe, for the average person. And music is a special thing in all cultures, right? We want people to have access to musical instruments to be able to play them. And if that's the case, then we need mass production. So the question then is, well, where is mass production happening? How are the workers treated, what's it like working in those factories, and what sort of materials are involved, and what's the environmental burden of mass production involved.
So what are some of the factories you went to that are still making guitars?
Yeah, we started here in Australia, visiting Cole Clark and Maton in Melbourne, which was fabulous, wonderful guitar makers. And we were happy enough to do that. That was amazing to go into those factories. And it was a strange thing where word spread and we started to get invitations, and Martin and Gibson guitars and Fender and the big American companies started to open their doors to us and let us go through their factories, which was a real thrill.
Well, what happened though when you started asking questions about where the timber comes from?
Yeah, initially people were a little bit reluctant to divulge information about their suppliers, but once they got a sense that we were guitar lovers and that we understood that mass production is something that is needed in the world if you want music to be democratic and you want guitars to be enjoyed by people everywhere, they started to understand what our objectives were. So they were more willing to come forward with information about their suppliers. But it always came with a word of warning, which was that, the people that are involved in the guitar timber trade, as it were, it's a sort of very small network, a community of people who they're quite big personalities and some quirky characters involved. So there's always a little word of warning, like you don't want to be turning up with big ideas and talk too much. Let these people talk and just listen and learn from who they are and listen to their perspective, because they're really unique people, and that turned out to be the case.
I had these preconceptions that a guitar factory would be about 99.999% blokey. You found that wasn't the case.
Look, the workforce, it varies, but it was probably 60-40 women over men in guitar factories around the world. They're connected to the places in which they're based. So Fender is in Southern California in a really Latino community. So the demography of that place is reflected in the culture of the factory. And there's a long tradition of Latino women working at Fender. So for one reason or another, there has been a kind of almost like the intergenerational transfer of jobs. So like this sense of families and communities that have worked a long time in these factories, and the job gets passed down from grandmother to daughter, onto granddaughter and so forth. So the factories kind of reproduce the cultures of each of the places in which they're based.
Are they cheerful places, social places, these factories?
On the whole, they are. In fact, surprisingly so. Or maybe it's not surprising, actually, when you think about the fact people are making guitars. They're not sitting in front of machines that are extruding out plastic parts to be made into, I don't know, toothpaste lids or something else. There's something special that's being made here. So there is a sense of like, we're making special things that people are going to love. You can sense that in the room. The people work hard and they work to schedules and there are production targets and all of the stuff that you'd find in a factory anywhere else. But people are working on guitars and they're working with wood. There is something about wood, and it's wood that's passing through this factory, and unusual pieces of wood. People really respect and care the wood that's involved in guitar making, and even in a mass manufacturing facility, because it's scarce, it's expensive, but it's also a joy to work with. It's such an amazing material to have skills with. So one of the things that we found was that these are not we're talking here about, guitar factories, mass production sort of facilities. We're not talking about the kind of guild-trained artisan maker. We're talking about factory floor workers, but actually have huge reserves of skill and know-how with wood that they've learnt through the years and through their fathers and mothers who've worked in the factory too. They can make their own guitars. They can make all sorts of stuff out of wood, and they've learnt those skills through just interacting with wood every day at their bench in the factory.
When it comes to finding the sawmills where the timbers are cut to make guitars, are these specialised places? Do you have to go to a special sawmill to find the special timbers to make guitars with?
You do. It used to be different. In an earlier era, forests were clear-felled, and whatever was in the forest got kind of cut up and distributed to be made into things, including guitars. And so the supply chains used to be much more part of the mainstream forestry industry, and that's all changed now. So if you went down to your average big box hardware store and you pick up a piece of timber there, that's probably come from a plantation. That plantation would be enormous, and it's growing probably only one species of tree, and it won't be a type of timber that you'll be able to make into something like a guitar. So the guitar industry has to rely on different places, different suppliers, different networks to be able to access those timbers. And they're trees that aren't grown in plantations. One of the sort of tragedies of the story, really, of the journey we went on, was to realise that almost without exception, at least with the exception of the Australian guitar timbers, interestingly, but almost without exception, the timbers are from places like Brazil and Madagascar that have got these long histories of colonial dispossession, exploitation, over forest deforestation, awful things happening. Or they're coming from places where the trees, the big trees are all gone. But the guitar industry needs those trees. It needs large old trees. It needs rare trees to supply it with those timbers. So it's increasingly difficult to get, and that requires specialists, these often one person or two people teams, little trading companies that, are in unusual places of the world. And so to try and track them down, figure out where they were, and to convince people that we could visit and be trusted was quite a difficult thing.
Well, did you find one in Australia?
Australia is really interesting because since the 1940s, Australian guitar companies have been trialling and innovating and using Australian timbers, and they're much more plentiful and sustainably grown. So Australian companies are at the forefront of replacing those rosewoods and spruces and things with Australian timbers. So we visited a number of Australian suppliers, and one of those characters is a man by the name of David Kirby, and his son Sam and his wife Kate, and they run a small timber supply company in a place called Diamond Valley, so kind of inland from the Sunshine Coast near the Bunya Mountains. And it's just an amazing family and an amazing place to visit. It's this sort of jungle hideout. When we first arrived there, you see what look like ramshackle sort of tin sheds that are lying about in ditches, and there's puddles, and over there is a big sort of saw hanging out there in the open. And you think, this doesn't look like a sawmill. When we visited big industrial sawmills in the US, these things are automated, and there's cranes, and there's efficient machinery and robots, and everything is clinically organised. And so this place was really different. But it turns out, through real trial and error, I guess, an experiment has figured out how you can take a log that might be gnarly and weird and actually craft that very carefully on a single log basis, log by log, cut very particular and delicate slices out of that to be made into guitars.
Why does the tree need to be so big in order to get a guitar out of it?
So if you imagine looking at a log and you're looking at it at its end, so you see a circle and you can see the growth rings, you need to cut across those growth rings, if you like. You have to kind of cut from the outside of the tree inwards, perfectly perpendicular to the grain. And that way, the slices that you get out of that log, you can then put on the front, on that soundboard of the guitar.
And that's all one piece of timber?
It's two pieces. So they do a thing called book matching, where they'll take a piece that might be, say, 8 to 10 millimetres thick, a slice like that, cut it down the middle very carefully, and then open those two pieces like a book. When they open those two pieces apart and join them together, that's the front of the guitar. So if you imagine looking at a guitar, if you look at it and you think, yeah, you've got roughly sort of 20, you draw a line down the middle, on either side you've got about 25 centimetres of wood there. That's at least the width that you need to have of the tree on one side of the centre of the tree. You can't cut through the centre of the tree because the centre of the tree is a sort of weak point. So imagine looking at a guitar, what it boils down to is that the tree's got to be at least as wide as the guitar if you want to cut it into guitar pieces.
You went into a forest on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada to see the beautiful Sitka tree, this beautiful spruce tree that has been providing timber for guitars.
It was quite a journey. We were tipped off to there's a part of Vancouver Island on the coast where these big old Sitka trees grow. It's really hard to get to. It's like 4 hours of bashing down logging roads to get to this old forest. And it's actually a really sad story, but there's not much of Vancouver Island protected. And there's not many of the big old trees left. So it took some tracking down to figure out where we had to go to see these old trees. Anyway, the day before we went, we were warned to be bear aware.
Bear aware. How does one become bear aware?
Well,
how does an Australian become bear aware? More to the point.
Well, exactly. So what you need is a whistle. We weren't convinced that was going to do much. And you need bear spray. So it's like pepper spray, basically. And the idea is that we watched the YouTube videos the night before, and the idea is you make a wall between yourself and the bear, right? You
like fly spray.
It's like fly spray.
Right.
You spray it from the ground upwards.
And would you hope that the bear won't like that?
It gets in their nose and it scares them away. But you've got like 10 seconds to make a decision. Is the bear trying to protect its young, and is it defensive and scared, or does it want to eat you? And depending on what you think is going on with the bear in the 10 seconds or 5 seconds you've got, your response is entirely differently. You either have to fight it off with whatever you can find, or you have to just stay really still and pretend it's not there and back away slowly. So anyway, we're 4 hours down this logging road thinking, oh my God, how are we going to, what happens if we actually see a bear? Like, how are we going to, we're talking ourselves into being totally afraid of bears, thinking, oh my God, this is going to be terrible. After the 4 hours on the logging roads ends and we finally turn up this obscure little spot where we're told to park, and from there's a little track you can head down a couple of hours down, hike down into the forest to see the old trees. And what is sitting there at the head of the trail, blocking our path from being able to get out of the car and head down into the forest, it's this huge bear.
What kind of a bear?
A huge adult black bear.
They're so dangerous.
We were in a car and we're thinking it's as big as the car. And of course we're petrified because we've been talking ourselves into being petrified by it.
Were you in the car or out of the car at this point?
Thankfully we were in the car,
right?
But it was standing between us and the trail we had to walk down to get to the old trees.
So did you get the bear spray out?
So we're frantically in the car trying to get the bear spray unclipped, and of course you didn't read the instructions before you did it, so there's that safety thing on the clip you didn't realise and all of that. Anyway, in the intervening time where we're muddling around with this spray trying to get it all sorted out, the bear decides that the car is more of a threat than anything else. So it decides to run off. But of course it runs down the trail right into the forest where we're about to hike. So we jump out of the car and we've got our bear spray out and we're thinking, look, we'll just make a wall. We'll make the wall out of the spray just to be safe. So we make the wall between us and the hiking trail. And of course we've blown this spray straight into the breeze. So the breeze just flows straight back on us and we're completely covered in this pepper spray. We're crying, our nose is stinging. We definitely felt like Aussies a very long way from home and very, very out of place.
So you went into the forest very bravely nonetheless, and that was the end of the black bear?
We didn't see the bear again, and thankfully we got down into the bottom of the coastal sort of area and saw these amazing old trees.
And what's it like being in those glades, away, like hours and hours away from any kind of other human? What's it like being in that quiet valley down there?
It's really disconcerting and amazing and majestic. It makes you feel tiny. That the trees are 150 feet up into the air. The trunks are as wide as a car.
And is it dark? Like the canopy in those forests can be really dark.
It's dark. There's moss on every single surface. There's not a dry twig anywhere. Like everything's rotting. There's undergrowth and ferns that are taller than you. And any tiny little sound you can hear thinking, oh my, it's the bear. It's the bear. So a
little snap of the twig. What's that?
Yeah, incredible places, really amazing.
And when you see one of these mature giant Sitka trees, these beautiful trees, what do they look like?
They're like nothing I've ever seen. I mean, they're just these perfectly round columns of wood. They're dark. They've got a kind of fish scale bark to them. It's like a feat of engineering.
And how long does it take for them to get that big?
The ones we were looking at were 400 to 500 years old. So
these aren't plantation trees, are they? The trees that are being harvested to make guitars are often 400 to 500 years old.
That's right. So this guitar I have right here, the timber on the front of the guitar here, it's Sitka spruce. And in fact, we tracked down the little sawmill that processed this back in the 70s and met some old workers from there, and it's come from 400 or 500 year old trees. Well, one of the other kind of things that we realised in talking to the millers that deal with those rare logs, and it's just an interesting thing because they really care for the forest, they really care for the trees. They don't want to see these forests destroyed. They just want a really tiny number of trees to make guitars out of. So they've actually got an interest in preserving these forests, but there's a sort of tragedy involved in them because in any given log that comes from a 500-year-old tree, a spruce tree like this, there might only be 5% of the wood that is made into beautiful and expensive guitars. And the other 95% of that wood is of a much lower grade, and it's to do with the way that you cut it. If you think about cutting through a log perpendicular like that, it's only going to be 1 in every 20th piece, say, that's beautifully perpendicular against the grain there, and it has the grain that's perfectly spaced and perfectly straight, which are the conditions you need for it to reverberate perfectly and beautifully. The rest of the log, all of those other slices of wood, are going to be pretty good, but they're not going to be perfect. And so they get downgraded and they sell for a fraction of the price.
Now, Gibson guitars, maker of the famous Les Paul electric guitar and a whole range of acoustic guitars as well. No family relation to you, it needs to be said.
It should be said, yeah.
It must be said. No family relation. There are more than a few Gibsons in this world. They were raided in 2009. What was the story behind that? Why were they raided?
It was twice, actually. They were raided in 2009 and again in 2011. So the US in 2008 created a piece of legislation that signed them up to an international covenant, a convention on protection of endangered species. What it really boils down to is that countries around the world agree to stop the trade in endangered species or products from. And so this is the bit of environmental regulation globally that protects things like ivory, for example. You know, when you can't turn up to Sydney Airport and have a bit of ivory in your bag, this is the convention that stops that from happening and that empowers those customs agents to seize your stuff.
And that applies to rare timbers too.
And it applies to rare timbers too, not just animals, but also plant products. And so in 2008, the US signed up to that. And at that time, a group of representatives from guitar companies, including Gibson and others, were in Madagascar looking at the availability of rosewood there. And so rosewood we've talked a little bit about, and it's this timber you use on fretboards and on the back and sides of guitars. It really got logged close to the point of extinction in Brazil. And in the Brazilian version of rosewood was listed on this convention. So it's like ivory.
And what about the rosewood in Madagascar? Is that protected?
It is now, but at the time it was a bit murkier. So it fell into a category of other rosewoods that didn't quite have the same legal status. So the guitar industry was trying to find alternatives, trying to find places that they could secure an ongoing supply of rosewood without the legal problems and without the extinction threat that's involved with Brazilian rosewood. But it turned out that in Madagascar at the time, it was going through a period of political upheaval, and there was a coup in 2009 which saw the overthrow of the Madagascan government, and efforts to try and protect its forests, including its rosewood trees, were upended in the middle of that coup. So suddenly rosewood, and as well as other trees, including ebony and other guitar timber, were starting to be felled and exported from the ports in Madagascar at that time illegally, and it became a real question mark over the provenance of those timbers. A lot of it actually ended up not in guitars at all, but in China in particular, being used for furniture making. So the global kind of lust for rosewood is actually driven more by the furniture industry than by the guitar industry, but this tree is doomed. The guitar industry is just caught up in these much wider forces. All of the rosewoods around the world now are protected more stringently through that convention. It does make it much more difficult to import and export that material, but the trade still happens. You know, it's a really difficult thing to come to grips with it as a guitar player. This thing we love and the materials we made out of it are damaging the planet.
Yeah, and where do musicians come into this? And famous musicians who are often campaigning against the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and who often doing benefit concerts for the environment for this or that, they still like their lovely guitars, though, don't they?
Look, I think there is a kind of growing realisation that it can't go on, that there is an imprint, an ecological burden associated with the things that we love. And
how about Fender? Like Fender's the home of the Stratocaster and the Telecaster. Are they aware of this as an issue?
They're really on top of it. Fender and Martin and Taylor guitars in the US are doing a lot. The mentality is shifting. So and in interesting ways. So, I mean, once upon a time you bought a 1980s Telecaster and you didn't know what wood was in it, and in fact it had bright red or pink paint on it and you didn't even know what was inside it. Now it's sort of flipping around, and so guitars are actually being marketed through their woods much more even to the mass-produced sort of market. So their designs are changing, and there's an embrace of alternative materials, and alternative sources of timbers are becoming much more common. So it is shifting, and the big manufacturers are definitely a part of that. Fender, a couple of years ago, shifted that. It started to take rosewood off its fretboards, for example, and shifted to alternative timbers. So they're among the companies that are definitely at the forefront of experimenting with different things and just really being more transparent with their consumer. You know, it's about musicians themselves also wanting to buy into that, I think, too.
So what is the future of guitars then? I mean, given that the planet's slowly being denuded of these majestic, gigantic trees that are required to make guitars, or they have been needed in the past, I mean, are the old ways of making guitars going to have to be abandoned? Or is there an alternative? Or are we going to have to start buying more second-hand guitars and reconditioning them? What's the future here?
I think it's all of the above. And so it's a real challenge to that mass manufacturing model. The idea that you can mass manufacture things and you can guarantee a supply chain, you just ring up your supplier and you get whatever materials it is you need. The guitar industry has really been, I think, a kind of canary in the coal mine, so to speak, in realising what disruption means, and that disruption that comes from ecological crises and planetary crises like what they're facing. So it's going to be all of the above. It's going to be caring for our guitars longer, buying more secondhand, reconditioning wood, finding wood that we can salvage and remake into things like guitars. So old pianos, the backs of those soundboards in old pianos are spruce. So there's now a little industry emerging around pulling the wood out of old pianos and turning it into guitars. It'll be all those things, and it'll be around a range of alternative materials too. So maybe we won't have guitars made of rosewood quite so plentifully anymore, and we might kind of mourn the loss of a traditional sounding guitar, but we'll end up with a different sounding guitar, and in that guitar will be timbers, one hopes, that have a more sustainable supply chain associated with them.
Great to speak with you, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure.
Chris Gibson is the co-author of the book The Guitar, Tracing the Grain Back to the Tree. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode of Conversations, then have a look at our playlist here and choose another episode to listen to. Or you can follow Conversations on the ABC Listen app and create your own playlist so you can listen to us anywhere, anytime that suits you.